Montana, 1887. A man so rich they called him a king. So hard-hearted he'd sent every elegant heiress back east in tears. Colton Sterling didn't believe in love. He believed in land, cattle, and silence. But then, in the middle of a midnight storm, a woman crawls onto his porch bleeding, soaked to the bone, gripping a Winchester rifle like it's the only thing keeping her alive. No fancy dress, no sweet smile, just eyes full of fury and contempt for his millions. She doesn't want his money. She wants work. And whatever she's running from, it's close. Because within days, a missing wife poster appears, offering a reward to return her to a man powerful enough to buy towns, judges, and killers. So here's the question. When the richest man in Montana finally finds something worth protecting, will he fight with gold or with gunpowder? Stay with me, because what happens next turns this ranch into a battlefield, and the ending is the kind of justice you feel in your bones. Lesson. Real strength isn't what you own. It's what you're willing to stand up for when everything is on the line. If you're ready for a story of courage, revenge, and love earned the hard way, hit like, drop a comment with what you would do in Abigail's boots, share this with a friend who loves Western drama, and subscribe so you don't miss next week's tale. Around Montana, they called him a king, a man who owned more land than the good Lord himself, and had a heart colder than a winter storm in the Rockies. For 10 long years, the richest women from Boston to San Francisco showed up in their fancy silk dresses, each one hoping she'd be the one to tame Colton Sterling and get her hands on his fortune. He sent every last one of them home crying. He'd sworn he would die a lonely man before he ever let a woman looking for a payday into his life. But then she appeared. She didn't roll up in a fine carriage. She dragged herself onto his porch during a downpour, bleeding, and clutching a Winchester rifle. And she looked at his millions with nothing but pure contempt. She wasn't after his money. She wanted to work, and that was the only thing his fortune couldn't buy. It was 1887, and the Montana Territory didn't have much patience for weakness. But weakness was a word Colton Sterling didn't even know. At 32, he was the sole owner of the Sterling Bar S cattle empire, a spread that covered 40,000 acres along the Yellowstone River. He was a man chiseled from stone, with eyes the color of cold steel, and a name that made other powerful men stammer. He sat there on the porch of his massive log mansion, a glass of fine Kentucky bourbon in one hand, a lit cigar in the other, just watching the dust kicking up on the horizon. Another carriage meant another suitor. "Boss, that's the coach from the station down in Billings." His foreman, a tough old codger named Dutch, grunted while leaning on the porch rail. The telegraph message said, "She's a Miss Clementine Vanderwall. Her daddy owns about half the steel that comes out of Pittsburgh." Colton didn't so much as flinch. He just took a long, slow pull from his cigar. "Send her home." "Colt, she came 3,000 miles, Dutch sighed, fiddling with his worn-out Stetson. "The least you could do is offer the lady a glass of lemonade." "I'm not running a boarding house, Dutch. I run a cattle ranch. If she wants a tour, she can pay $1 just like everybody else at the county fair. And if she's looking for a husband, you can tell her the job's been filled permanently." Colton pushed himself up from his chair. The jingle of his silver spurs was a sharp sound against the worn leather of his boots. He was a handsome man, no one could deny it, with a jaw that looked sharp enough to cut diamonds and shoulders that strained the seams of his flannel shirt. But his money had become his curse. Ever since he hit it big in the Black Hills and turned that gold into the biggest cattle operation out west, he'd become a prize to be won. Every week, a new woman would show up. They were always beautiful, smelled like expensive perfume, and were as phony as a $3 bill. They looked at him and just saw a walking bank vault. They looked at his ranch and pictured a vacation home. Not a single one of them saw the sweat, the blood, or the bone-chilling nights he'd endured to build this life. The carriage pulled up the long dirt road, its shiny black paint reflecting the afternoon sun. A driver in a starched uniform jumped down to open the door. Miss Vanderwall stepped out, looking like a dream in blue silk and holding a parasol that probably cost more than a cowboy's entire year of wages. Colton walked down the porch steps, his boots making heavy thuds on the wood. "Mr. Sterling," she purred, fluttering her eyelashes. "My father speaks so very highly of you. I just had to come see this untamed wilderness for myself." Colton stopped about 3 feet away from her. He could smell the lavender perfume she used to cover up the scent of horse manure she was trying so hard not to step in. "Well, you've seen it," Colton said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Now you can turn right around." Her perfect smile wavered. I beg your pardon?" "You're here because your father wants to merge our shipping operations," Colton stated, getting straight to the point. "And you're here because you think a rich cowboy is some kind of interesting new toy. You'd be bored in a week and miserable in a month. I don't have time for either. Driver." The driver immediately stood at attention. "Yes, sir. Take her back to Billings. Put her on the very next train heading east. Send the bill to the ranch." "You rude, arrogant monster," Clementine gasped, her face turning bright red. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Colton said, already turning his back on her. "You're the 23rd woman this year who has come here to waste my time." He strode back into the house and slammed the heavy oak door shut, completely ignoring her furious yelling. He poured himself another drink and stared into the empty room. It was lonely, all right. The quiet in that big old house could swallow a man whole. But silence was a whole lot better than listening to pretty little lies. He figured that was enough excitement for one day. He was dead wrong. That night, a storm came barreling in off the mountains, a howling, angry thing that rattled the windows of the ranch house. The rain fell in solid sheets, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Sometime around midnight, the dogs started barking. It wasn't the happy bark they used for visitors. It was the deep, throaty growl they saved for predators. Colton snatched his Colt Peacemaker from the nightstand and crept downstairs in the darkness. He yanked open the front door, half expecting to see a wolf or maybe a horse thief. Instead, he found a bundle of wet rags, crumpled on his porch steps. He lowered his pistol and moved in for a closer look. It was a woman. She was soaked clear through. Her dress was ripped and caked with mud. Her hair was plastered to her face. But the thing that really got his attention was her grip. Even passed out, her knuckles were bone white as she clutched a dirty canvas sack to her chest. "Dutch!" Colton bellowed over the clap of thunder. "Get the doctor, now!" He holstered his pistol and carefully scooped her into his arms. She was dangerously light, like she hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. As he carried her into the warmth of the huge foyer, her head lolled back. Colton stopped in his tracks. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way those heiresses were. Her features were carved, not delicate. A scar cut right through her left eyebrow, and the calluses on her hands felt like rough leather against his skin. She smelled like rain, pine trees, and faint old gunpowder. He gently laid her down on the big leather sofa near the fireplace. As the firelight danced across her face, her eyes fluttered open. They weren't soft or pleading. They were the terrified, wild hazel eyes of a cornered animal. She gasped and scrambled backward against the cushions, her hand immediately darting for a knife strapped to her thigh underneath her tattered dress. "Easy now," Colton said, holding his hands up where she could see them. "You're safe here. You're at the Bar S Ranch." She frantically looked around the room, her eyes wide as she took in the crystal chandelier, the bearskin rug, and all the polished mahogany furniture. Most women looked at his things with greed. She looked at them with pure, unadulterated panic. "I can't be here," she rasped. She tried to get to her feet, but her legs buckled beneath her. Colton caught her just before she hit the floor. "You're not going anywhere in this storm," he said, his tone firm. "Who are you?" She pulled away from his grasp, hugging that canvas bag even tighter. "My name doesn't matter. I need a horse. I can pay you. I've got work in me." "You can hardly stand up, Colton." pointed out. "And I don't need any of your money." "I don't want your charity," she snapped back, a spark of fire flashing in her eyes that took him by surprise. "I earn my keep. I can cook, I can clean, I can muck out stalls. Just don't you ask me where I came from." Colton narrowed his gaze. He'd spent a lifetime reading men across poker tables and sizing them up during cattle deals. He knew what a liar looked like. But this woman, she wasn't lying to get something from him. She was lying to get away from something. "I'm Colton Sterling," he said slowly. He waited for the usual reaction, the gasp, the eyes widening at the name that was printed in every newspaper west of the Mississippi. She just stared at him, without a flicker of recognition. "Good for you. I'm Mary, just Mary." "Well, just Mary," Colton said, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're bleeding all over my rug." She glanced down at her side, where a dark stain was slowly spreading across the fabric of her dress. She hadn't even winced. "It's just a scratch," she muttered. "From what?" She looked up at him then, and for just a moment, her tough-as-nails mask cracked. He saw a weariness in her eyes so deep it made his own chest feel heavy. "From a life I ran away from," she whispered. "Please, sir, just let me sleep in the barn tonight. I swear I'll be gone before the sun comes up." Colton looked out at the storm still raging outside, then looked back at this strange, fierce woman who would rather have his barn than his bedroom. "You'll stay in the guest room," Colton ordered, "and in the morning we can talk about you mucking out stalls." 3 days went by and Mary, who he was sure wasn't named Mary at all, was still there. But she hadn't been resting. Colton had fully expected her to stay in that fancy guest bed, asking for tea and feeling sorry for herself. Instead, on the very first morning, Dutch found her in the kitchen at 4 a.m, with her side bandaged up, scrubbing the heavy cast-iron skillets with a fury that nearly gave the ranch cook a heart attack. By noon that day, she had completely reorganized the pantry. By that evening, she was out in the yard, chopping firewood. Colton watched her from the window of his study. She was wearing an old, oversized shirt and a pair of trousers he'd given her, held up with a piece of rope. She swung that axe with perfect practiced form, hips steady, shoulders providing all the power. That wasn't how a servant swung an axe. That was how someone who knew how to handle a weapon swung an axe. "She works harder than half the men I've got," Dutch remarked, standing next to Colton. "But she's skittish. Every time a rider comes up the road, she disappears." "She's running from the law," Colton guessed out loud. "I don't think so," Dutch said, shaking his head. "I've seen my share of outlaws. They've got a certain strut about them. She's got the look of prey. Somebody's hunting her, boss." Colton felt a strange wave of protectiveness wash over him. It irritated him. He wasn't in the business of taking in strays. He walked out to the woodpile. She was so focused on the rhythmic sound of the axe-splitting pine that she didn't hear him coming. "You're going to tear those stitches open," he said. She spun around in a flash, holding the axe across her chest like a shield before she saw it was him. She lowered it slowly, using a dirty forearm to wipe the sweat from her brow. "I'm paying for my room and board," she said, still out of breath. "I already told you I don't need any payment. And I told you I don't take charity from rich men." The bitterness in her voice was so sharp it could have cut steel. Colton took a step closer, invading her space. "You have a problem with rich men, Mary? I have a problem with men who think they own the whole world just because they can afford to buy it," she shot back, not giving up a single inch of ground. She looked straight up at him, her hazel eyes blazing with fire. "I've seen what money does to a man. It rots him clean through from the inside out." Colton was speechless. Women usually looked at him and saw a walking fortune. She looked at him and saw a sickness. "I built this place," he said, his voice low and tight, "with my own 2 hands." Colton's voice was low and steady. "I'm the one who dug the post holes. I'm the one who branded the cattle. Do not think for a second you know me. And don't you dare think you own me just because you put a few stitches in my side," she fired back. They locked eyes, and the air in the room grew heavy and thick. It was the first time in a long while anyone had spoken to him without a trace of fear or flattery. He found it strangely appealing. "All right," Colton said. "You're looking for work? The cook up and quit last week. The job is yours, $5 a week, and that includes your room and your meals. But there's one condition. You eat with me." She paused for a moment. "I take my meals in the kitchen. You will eat at the dining table. That's my offer. You can take it, or you can leave it." She clenched her jaw. You could see her turning the options over in her mind. "Fine, but I'm not putting on any of those fancy dresses." Colton almost smiled. "You can wear a burlap sack for all I care. Dinner is at 7. That night, something fundamental changed in the Sterling household. The long mahogany table, a place where Colton usually sat alone, eating in silence while he went over his ledgers, had now become a field of battle. She had cleaned up and was wearing a simple cotton dress that one of the maids had loaned her. It was a plain, unflattering gray, but for some reason Colton could not look away. "So," Colton began, slicing into his steak, "whereabouts are you from, Mary? That accent of yours isn't from around here. Sounds like it might be from Kansas, or maybe Missouri." Her fork stopped in midair. "I am from somewhere else." Colton spoke casually, but his words carried weight. "You know, I have some friends in the United States Marshals Service. If you have found yourself in some trouble—" There was a loud clatter as she dropped her fork. Her hands had started to shake. "I am not a criminal, Mr. Sterling." "Then tell me why you sleep with a chair propped up under the knob of your door?" She turned pale as a ghost. "You have been checking on me." "This is my house. I check on everything in it." He leaned in closer. "I can help you, but you are going to have to tell me the truth. What is your real name?" She shot up from her chair. "Thank you for the dinner. I will go clear the plates now." "Sit down," Colton commanded. "I am your employee. I am not your prisoner," she yelled back. "You are a woman, all alone in this territory with a bullet grazed on your side and a name that is not your own. Do you really think you will be safe if the person who did that to you finds you out here?" "If he finds me," she said with a cold and terrifying calm, "I will kill him." The whole room fell silent. "He?" Colton asked, his voice now gentle. She turned her head away, and her breathing was heavy and uneven. "My husband?" A cold knot tightened in Colton's gut. Of course, it was not the law she was running from. It was a man who had hurt her so badly she would run headfirst into a storm to get away. "He is a very powerful man," she whispered, staring into the fireplace. "He has men everywhere. If he finds out I am here, he will not just hurt me. He will burn this precious ranch of yours down to the ashes just for spite." Colton took a slow sip of his wine, and his eyes grew dark. He thought of all the women who had wanted him for the safety he could offer, and for the money he possessed. And here was a woman trying to protect him by leaving. "Let him try," Colton said, his voice calm and even. She looked at him, completely confused. "You do not understand. He owns half the judges in St. Louis. He's not in St. Louis anymore," Colton interrupted. "He is in Montana. And out here in Montana, we do not buy judges. We buy Winchesters." He got to his feet and ambled over to the whiskey cabinet, pouring another measure of bourbon into a clean glass. He pushed it gently across the wooden table toward her. "What do folks call you?" he asked again. This time his voice wasn't demanding. It was an offering of peace. She paused for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the glass. She looked up at him, scanning his eyes for the familiar deception she expected to find in a man. There was none. "My name is Abigail," she said, her voice just a whisper. "Abigail Miller." "Well now, Abigail," Colton said, lifting his own glass. "Welcome to the Sterling Bar S. First thing tomorrow, I am going to teach you the right way to handle that rifle." If your husband shows up, I want you to be the one to send him on his way." For the first time, a real honest-to-goodness smile found its way to her lips. It changed her whole face, making her glow despite being bone-tired. "I already know my way around a rifle, Mr. Sterling," she told him. "I just chose to miss." A dry chuckle escaped Colton. It sounded like a rusty hinge he had not used in a long, long time. "In that case, we will just work on sharpening your aim." But as the days slowly bled into weeks and Abigail's presence became a normal part of the ranch, the world beyond their fences started to intrude. One afternoon, Colton had to ride into town for the telegraph office. The town, a place full of tough men and courageous souls, was humming with fresh gossip. A wealthy new investor had just set foot in the territory, a man buying up land near the water sources with aggressive speed. Colton went into the general store to get some supplies. That is when he saw a wanted poster tacked to the wall. It was not for a bank robber, though. It was a notice for a missing person. A substantial reward for the return of Mrs. Abigail Rock, the beloved wife of Jebediah Rock, who is suffering from hysteria and delusions. Colton just stared at the drawing. It was her, no doubt about it. And the name hit him like a punch to the gut. Jebediah Rock. He was not just some powerful man from St. Louis. He was the Eastern investor that all the newspapers had been writing about, the same man known for his ruthless ways, for burning out homesteaders and hiring Pinkerton agents to break up strikes. Colton tore the poster right off the wall and crushed it in his fist. "Is there a problem, Mr. Sterling?" the shopkeeper asked, a nervous tremor in his voice. "No," Colton replied, his voice deadly quiet. "Just cleaning up some of the trash." He stepped back out into the bright sunlight, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. Rock was looking for her, and he was on his way to Montana. Colton swung himself up on his horse and spurred it into a gallop back toward the ranch. He had promised himself he would never let anyone get close to him again. He had built tall walls of gold and cynicism to keep the world out, but as he rode, thinking of Abigail, picturing her laughing with Dutch in the kitchen, thinking about how she did not care one bit about his money but actually cared about him, he knew those walls had already been torn down. A war was coming to the Bar S, and for the first time in his entire life, Colton Sterling had something to lose that was worth more than every head of cattle he owned put together. Colton pushed the sorrel mare hard on the ride back to the ranch, the crumpled wanted poster feeling like a hot coal in his saddlebag. The truth had settled over him like a funeral shroud. He was not just giving shelter to a runaway, he was hiding the property of one of the most ruthless industrial barons in the entire country. When he reached the top of the ridge that overlooked the Bar S, he saw Abigail. She was down in the corral, breaking a particularly stubborn Mustang. She was covered from head to toe in dust, her hair flying free from its braid, and she was laughing as the horse bucked beneath her. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered freedom. A tightness gripped Colton's chest. Jebediah Rock wanted to capture that laugh and lock it away in a golden cage back in St. Louis. He urged his horse down to the corral, swinging out of the saddle before the mare had even come to a full stop. Abigail saw the look on his face, and her smile vanished in an instant. She slid off the Mustang and started backing away as he walked toward her, feeling the change in the air. "Colton, what is wrong?" He did not say a word. He just reached into his saddlebag, took out the crumpled poster, and flattened it against a post of the corral fence. Abigail's face turned as white as a sheet. The color drained from her lips so quickly that Colton worried she might faint again. She stared at the sketch of her own face, captured right under the headline, "Suffering from Hysteria and Delusions." "It is a lie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I am not crazy. He needed a good reason for why I would run away from all his millions. Hysteria is the easiest excuse in the world to lock a woman away." "Why did you not tell me it was Rock?" Colton asked, his voice strained and tight. "Because if you knew, you would have sent me back," she cried, tears starting to fill her hazel eyes. "Everyone sends me back, the sheriffs, the judges. Rock owns every last one of them. He does not love me, Colton. I'm an acquisition to him. I am a merger he has not managed to close yet." She turned to bolt toward the house. probably to grab her small canvas bag and disappear back into the wilderness. Colton grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron, but he was gentle. "Let me go," she sobbed, struggling against him. But her efforts were weak. "He will destroy you. You have no idea what he is like. He hires men, Pinkertons, bounty hunters, men who get paid to hurt people. If they find me here, they will burn down everything you have ever built." "Let them try," Colton said again. She stopped fighting him and just stared up at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "What?" "I said, let him try." Colton pulled her in closer, so close he could feel her trembling against his chest. "You were right, Abigail. I thought I could buy my own safety. I thought this ranch was a fortress. But a fortress is just a pile of walls if you do not have something inside of it worth protecting." He looked down deep into her eyes, where he could see the fear and a small flicker of hope fighting a war inside her. "You are done running. If Jebediah Rock wants a war in Montana, then I will give him one." Colton did not waste a single moment on sentiment. After that, he shifted into war mode. He called Dutch and his top 5 ranch hands into his study, men who had ridden with him since his days in the Black Hills. These were men who were as good with a gun as they were with a branding iron. "The woman who is staying with us is Jebediah Rock's wife," Colton stated plainly, pouring whiskey for each of the men. "He is coming to get her, and he is bringing hired guns with him." Dutch let out a long, low whistle. "The Railroad Rock. That is some heavy trouble, boss." "If anyone wants to collect their pay and ride on out of here, do it now," Colton said. "There will be no hard feelings. This is not a cattle drive. This is going to be a siege." Not a single man made a move for the door. They just picked up their glasses of whiskey. "I never did like railroad men anyway," Dutch grumbled into his glass. "They always spook the herds." "We need to fortify this place," Colton ordered. "Dutch, you break out those crates of Henry repeaters we have in the cellar. I want 2 men up on the ridgeline day and night with the long-range Sharps rifles. Nobody gets within a mile of this main house without us knowing about it." He paused, looking at each of his men. "And listen to me. Rock does not hire local drunks. He hires professionals. The kind of men who read about Charlie Siringo and decided he was a role model. Too gentle. They would draw first, so we had to be faster." Just like that, the whole feel of the ranch changed. The easy rhythm of tending to cattle was gone, replaced by the sharp, quiet focus of a camp bracing for a fight. Shutters were bolted on the windows. Boxes of cartridges were handed out. Abigail took it all in from the porch, feeling a wave of disbelief. No one had ever stood up for her before. She was always a piece in a trade, never the reason for a stand. 2 days passed, then the first sign of the enemy showed itself. Colton was perched on the roof of the main house, peering through his brass telescope at the horizon. He caught the flash of morning sun on something made of metal, about 3 miles out. 4 men on horseback. They did not ride like cowhands. They sat tall in their saddles, straight-backed like soldiers or gunslingers hired out of the city. They pulled up on a ridge overlooking the valley, using their own field glasses to study the ranch layout. Colton snapped the telescope shut, his jaw clenched hard. "Scouts," he said to himself. "They're here," Colton called down. Dutch was on the porch below, carefully oiling a shotgun. Abigail pushed open the front door, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She stared toward the far-off ridge, then looked back as Colton scrambled down the ladder. The fear was still in her eyes, but a new feeling was mixing in with it. Was it determination? "Is there a gun for me?" she asked, her voice low. Colton gave her a long look, then tipped his head toward the gun rack just inside the door. "Take the Winchester 73. It is light enough to handle and shoots true. Get back in the house and stay clear of the windows." She gave a single nod, her face pale but determined. She disappeared back inside. Colton stood on his porch, the master of his land, watching the four riders wheel their horses around and gallop back toward town. They were going to report to the man who paid them. The heavy quiet that comes before a storm settled over the Yellowstone Valley. The time for waiting was done. Jebediah Roar did not sneak in at night, like a common thief. He made his approach at high noon 3 days after his scouts had returned. He traveled with an entire group. A shiny black carriage was protected on all sides by 12 riders. The men wore long duster coats and were armed to the teeth, their faces hidden in the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. They moved in a tight, practiced formation that suggested they were paid well for their violent work. Colton waited for them at the main gate of his ranch compound. He stood all by himself, leaning casually against a fence post. His Winchester rifle was cradled in the bend of his arm. Behind him, from the windows of the house and the hayloft of the barn, the rifle barrels of his men were aimed directly at the approaching group. The convoy came to a halt about 20 yards away. The dust began to settle. The carriage door swung open, and Jebediah Roar stepped out. He was a jarring sight against the wild, rugged land. He was dressed in a gray suit, expertly tailored, that likely cost more than Colton's finest horse. He wore a silk tie and a bowler hat. His face was clean-shaven. His skin was pale from too many years spent in offices, but his eyes were like cold black stones, empty of any human kindness. He carried the smell of expensive cologne and the stink of city corruption. Roar smoothed the cuffs of his shirt and strode toward the gate, stopping about 10 feet from Colton. He sized up the rancher with the same cold interest he would show a piece of equipment he was planning to either purchase or smash. "Mr. Sterling," Roar began. His voice was slick and polished, with an accent from the east that set Colton's teeth on edge. "You have a remarkable piece of property here, a real monument to frontier spirit." "Say what you came to say, Roar, and then get off my land," Colton answered, his voice rough like stones grinding together. Roar gave a small smile, a tight pull of his lips that never touched his eyes. "So direct. I appreciate that. I have come for my wife, Abigail. I am told my poor, confused girl has been taking advantage of your kindness. She has a habit of getting lost in wild fantasies, you understand. The only thing she is suffering from are the marks you left on her," Colton shot back. Roar's phony smile disappeared in an instant. A brief flash of pure anger showed on his face. "Listen to me, Cowboy. You are meddling in a world with rules you cannot possibly comprehend. Abigail belongs to me. She is my wife and my property, under the eyes of God and the letter of the law. I am willing to be generous for the trouble you have gone to, $5,000 for her safe return, and I will overlook your disrespect." He snapped his fingers, and one of his riders threw a heavy leather pouch that landed in the dirt by Colton's boots. It made the sound of gold coins clinking together. Colton never even glanced down at it. "Keep your money and stay off my land. If you or any of your hired thugs step 1 foot past this fence line, we will start shooting." Roar just stared at him. He was not a man who was used to hearing the word no. In his life, every single thing and every single person had a price. "Abigail!" Roar suddenly yelled toward the house, his voice echoing across the yard. "I know you can hear me. Come out to your husband. Put an end to this nonsense before these simple folk get themselves hurt because of you." The front door of the ranch house creaked open. "Abigail, you stay inside," Colton ordered, his eyes still locked on Roar's men, who all had their hands hovering just above their pistols. But Abigail stepped out onto the porch. She was carrying the Winchester rifle Colton had given her. Her hands were trembling, but she walked down the steps until she stood right behind the gate next to Colton. When Roar saw her holding that rifle, saw the defiance in the way she stood, and saw her standing beside the rancher, his mask of sophistication shattered completely. "Just look at you," Roar sneered, his voice filled with poison. "Dressed like a farmhand. Have you been letting this animal have his way with you out in the barn? Is this what you want, Abigail? You truly prefer the smell of cattle over a civilized life?" Abigail brought the rifle up to her shoulder. It had some real heft to it, but she held it firm, pointed directly at the middle of Roe's chest. "I will take a man over a monster any day," Abigail's voice rang out, sharp and loud in the valley's stillness. "You need to leave, Jebediah. I am not ever going back there with you. I would rather draw my last breath on this very patch of dirt than live one more day in your grand house." Roe glanced at the rifle, then to Colton's unyielding expression, and finally up toward the sunlight catching on gun barrels in the barn loft. He was outgunned, and in a terrible position. Jebediah Roe was not a man who engaged in fights he was not certain to win. "Fine, then," Roe said quietly, his voice laced with poison, was replaced by pure ice. He stared at Colton. "You believe this is finished because you have more rifles today, Mr. Sterling? You are a rancher. You depend on banks. You depend on railroads to move your cattle, on stores in town for supplies. You only exist because the civilized world allows you to." Roar placed his bowler hat back on his head. "You want to keep her? Fine. But you will first watch everything else you have built turn to dust. I will ruin you, Sterling. I will starve this ranch until you are on your knees, begging me to take her back just so you can afford a meal." He spun around, climbed back into his carriage, and the entire group rode off. As they disappeared, Colton spit into the dirt right next to the bag of gold. "He's just bluffing," Dutch said, walking up behind them with his shotgun lowered. "No," Colton said, his voice grim as he watched the dust cloud shrink in the distance. "He is not. He knows he cannot win a gunfight here today. So now he will fight with the weapons he understands best, money and power." The siege was on. It did not begin with bullets, but with paperwork. Within a single week, the consequences of Roar's threat became very real. Colton rode into town to secure a loan for new Hereford bulls, which he needed to improve his herd. The bank president, a man Colton had known for 10 years, refused to look him in the eye. "I am sorry, Colt. The loan committee, they turned down the application. They say the cattle market is just too unstable at the moment." "Unstable? Beef prices are the highest they have been in 5 years, Colton said, slamming his fist on the man's desk. "Roar got to you, did not he? He threatened to take his money out of your bank." The banker looked away, his face a picture of misery. "I have a family, Colt. I cannot stand up against railroad money. You should just send the woman back." But it did not end there. The general store suddenly ran into supply problems with flour and coffee when Dutch went to buy provisions. The local blacksmith was all of a sudden too busy to put new shoes on Colton's horses. Jebediah Roar was cutting off the ranch, turning the very town that Colton had helped grow against him with a mix of fear and cash. Back at the bar S, the mood was heavy. The ranch hands were getting tense. They could not even go into town for a drink without being bothered by Roar's men, who were now lounging on every street corner. One evening, Colton walked into the barn and found Abigail packing her few belongings into a small canvas satchel. He snatched it out of her hands. "Just where do you think you're going?" "I am destroying you," she said, her eyes swollen and red from crying. "He is strangling this ranch, Colton. The men are on edge. The bank has abandoned you. I will not let you lose your entire life because of me. If I return to him, he will leave you be." Colton tossed the bag into a pile of hay. He took her by the shoulders and gave her a small shake. "Now you listen to me," he growled. "I spent 10 years of my life building a fortune because I believed it would make me safe. I was mistaken. All it did was make me lonely. Roar thinks he can starve us. We have 4,000 head of cattle. We have fresh water. We have plenty of meat. We can hold out much longer than his patience will." He pulled her into a hug, his hand getting tangled in her hair. And for the very first time, he kissed her. It was not a soft kiss. It was rough and desperate, fueled by his fury at Roar, and the sudden, shocking realization of how much he had come to need her. She leaned into him, kissing him back with the same intensity, grabbing his shirt as if it were a lifeline. When they finally broke apart, both out of breath, Colton pressed his forehead against hers. "We do not fold, Abigail," he whispered with a fierce intensity. "We raise. Tomorrow morning, we stop playing defense. It is time to hit Roar where he lives." The idea was pure craziness, but desperate times often lead to the most daring plans. Jebediah Roar had control of the local railroad line in Billings. He had paid off the station master to deny any cattle cars from the Sterling Ranch. If they were unable to ship their cattle, they could not get paid. And if they could not get paid, the bank would take the Bar S in less than a month. Colton called his men into the bunkhouse before the sun came up. The air was chilly, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp soil. "Roar thinks he has us trapped," Colton told the 20 men gathered before him. "He might own the tracks here, but he does not own the Union Pacific line down in Casper, Wyoming. That is 200 miles south, straight through Badland Sioux country and some real rough terrain." A low murmur spread through the room. A 200-mile cattle drive with 3,000 animals was a massive challenge, even under the best of conditions. Going up against that tycoon's hired army was a fool's errand. "I can't make you ride with me," Colton said, his voice low. "This stopped being a job. Now it is a war. If any of you want to stay back and guard the house, there is no shame in it." Dutch aimed a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Heck, boss," he drawled. "The whiskey in Casper is better anyway. Count me in." Around the room, one by one, the other hands gave a firm nod. They were loyal to the ranch, but more than that, they were loyal to the man who always treated them with respect, not like work animals. From the shadows by the doorway, Abigail stepped into the light. She was dressed completely in riding clothes with denim pants, a thick coat, and a wide-brimmed hat she had pulled from the supply closet. A bandolier filled with ammunition was slung across her shoulder. "I am going with you," she declared. "Abigail, no," Colton began. "It is far too dangerous. You need to stay here where you will be safe." "If I stay here, Roar will just set the house on fire with me in it," she shot back. "And this is my fight, too. You are all risking your lives for my sake. I am not going to sit on the porch and knit while you are dodging bullets." Colton stared at her. The frightened young woman from the storm had vanished. Standing before him was a true woman of the West. He gave a single sharp nod. "Go get your horse." The cattle drive started at the first sign of dawn. The rumble of 3,000 cattle on the move felt like a low, rolling earthquake. A plume of dust climbed a mile into the sky, announcing their location to anyone who was looking. And Roar was definitely looking. For the first 3 days, the attacks were all in their heads. Roar's men would show up on far-off ridges, staying just beyond the reach of a rifle, simply following them. At night, they fired their guns into the air, which kept the cattle jumpy and the cowboys from sleeping. Exhaustion started to take its toll almost immediately. Colton took the lead position, his gaze always sweeping across the rugged land. He got almost no sleep, running on nothing but black coffee and nerves. Abigail rode swing, making sure none of the stragglers fell behind. She pulled her weight just like any of the men, eating dust with her face covered by a bandana. On the 4th night, they set up camp beside a shallow creek inside a tight valley. The cattle were uneasy, moaning softly in the dark. "They are planning to hit us tonight," Colton said quietly to Dutch as they sat near the small campfire. "The land opens up tomorrow. If they are going to try and scatter this herd, this narrow spot is where they will do it." He was right. At 200 in the morning, a huge explosion shook the valley. It was dynamite. Pure panic erupted in an instant. The cattle, terrified by the loud blast and the blinding flash of light, bolted forward in a wild stampede. The whole ground trembled. "Ride and turn them!" Colton yelled, swinging himself onto his horse. Everything descended into chaos. The herd became a living flood of muscle and horn, charging directly for the edge of a canyon. If they went over that cliff, the ranch would be ruined. Colton rode like a madman, galloping through the darkness and putting all his trust in his horse's ability to see at night. He spotted Abigail riding hard along the left side, firing her pistol in the air, trying to turn the lead animals. "Abigail, fall back!" Colton bellowed over the roar of the hooves. "There is no room!" She could not hear him. She dug her spurs into her horse, getting dangerously close to the thundering herd, waving her hat and yelling at the animals. Suddenly, gunshots came from the cliffs overhead. Roar's men were firing down into the cattle, making the panic even worse. Bullets zipped right past Colton's ear. Colton watched as a steer tripped and fell directly in the path of Abigail's horse. Her horse reared up high, throwing her to the ground. "Abigail!" Colton wrenched his reins, steering his horse straight into the stampede. He leaned far out of his saddle, reaching down like a performer in a rodeo. Abigail was scrambling on the ground, with hooves pounding just inches from her head. He flew by, grabbing her arm with a power that came from sheer terror. He pulled her up onto his horse behind him, just as the wave of cattle washed over the spot where she had fallen. They rode to higher ground, completely out of breath. Down below, Dutch and the rest of the crew had somehow turned the herd away from the cliff's edge, getting them to circle into a confused, churning group. Abigail threw her arms around Colton's waist and buried her face in his coat. She was shaking all over. "I thought you were gone," Colton said, his voice raspy, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm still here," she whispered. "We are still here." The herd was safe, but they had lost precious time. Next, they had to cross Devil's Pass, a tight, twisting trail that wound through granite mountains and led to the Wyoming border. It was the absolute perfect spot for an ambush. Colton went to scout the trail by himself. He got off his horse and crawled up a rocky hill, looking through his binoculars. Just as he suspected, near the tightest curve in the pass, he saw the shine of sunlight on metal. Men were hidden behind large rocks on both sides of the path. Roar had sent his main group ahead to trap them. There were at least 20 gunmen waiting for them up there. Colton hurried back down to the others. "We cannot go through there," Colton told his men. "It is a death trap. They will shoot us down one after another." "We cannot go back either," Dutch pointed out, wiping a layer of grime from his cheek. "And we cannot go around. These mountains are impossible for a herd of cattle." Colton pictured the map in his mind. There was no other way. Unless... He glanced over at Abigail. She was checking the mechanism on her Winchester rifle. "I have an idea," Colton said slowly. "But it is very risky. It needs some bait." "I will do it," Abigail said without a moment's hesitation. "Absolutely not," Colton snapped back. "They are after me, Colton," she argued with intensity. "If they see me, they will hold their fire. They will not risk harming the prize that Roar wants back. If you ride out there, they will just shoot you on sight." Colton clenched his jaw. She was right. The thought of it made him sick to his stomach, but she was right. The plan was made. An hour later, a lone rider entered the pass. Abigail sat up straight and tall in the saddle with a white flag tied around the barrel of her rifle. She came to a stop right in the center of the trap. "I am here," she called out, and her voice bounced off the canyon walls. "I am surrendering. Just let the men and the herd go." High up on the rocks, the leader of Roar's mercenaries motioned for his men to not shoot. He stood up. "Smart girl. Now get down from that horse." While every single eye was focused on Abigail, nobody thought to look up. Colton and 10 of his most skilled marksmen had scaled the steep rock wall on the far side of the canyon ridges. It was a difficult, quiet climb, but they were now in position 50 feet above Roar's men. Colton looked down the sights of his rifle. He saw the mercenary leader striding toward Abigail with a smug look on his face. Colton took a long, steadying breath. "Now!" Colton shouted. 10 rifles cracked at the exact same time from the high peaks. The men waiting in ambush were suddenly the ones being ambushed. The unexpected shower of bullets coming from above sent Roar's men into total confusion. They had no place to hide from that high angle. The mercenary leader scrambled behind a rock, completely trapped. Abigail spurred her horse and galloped back toward the safety of the herd, while bullets kicked up dirt all around her. "Push them," Colton yelled to his men. "Do not give them a chance to regroup." The gunfight was fierce, but it was over quickly. Exposed and outmaneuvered, Roar's hired guns lost their nerve. They were not fighting for their homes or their families. They were fighting for money, and no amount of money was worth dying for in that canyon. They scrambled to their horses and fled south, leaving the pass completely clear. Colton slid the last 10 feet down the rocks to the trail. Abigail rode right up to him, her face bright with excitement. "You crazy, wonderful woman." Colton laughed. He pulled her down from her horse and gave her a long, hard kiss right there in front of everyone. The cowboys let out a cheer, waving their hats in the air. They had broken through the blockade. The path to Casper was finally open. To the exhausted, dust-covered crew from the Sterling Bar S Ranch, Casper, Wyoming was a symphony of steam whistles, bellowing cattle, and yelling traders. It sounded like a heavenly choir. They had driven 3,000 head of cattle, through hell and back, across 200 miles of the toughest country in the West, and they had made it with the entire herd. The stockyards were a confusing maze of wooden chutes and pens, crowded with buyers from places like Chicago and St. Louis. When the Bar S beef was checked, its high quality was obvious. Even after the hard journey, the Hereford cattle were in perfect condition. The auction was intense but quick, ending with a handshake that guaranteed the ranch's future. Colton Sterling stood at the teller window in the Wells Fargo Bank, watching the clerk count out stacks of banknotes, $112,000. It was enough to settle the mortgage, give each of his men a full year's bonus, and still have plenty left over to tell those bankers in Montana exactly where to go. He turned to Abigail. She was leaning on the mahogany wall, gazing out the window at the bustling street. She still had on her trail clothes, dusty denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and the gun belt that now looked as natural on her as a string of pearls would on a lady from the city. "It is finished," Colton said, his voice heavy with emotion. He held up the thick envelope. "We are free." Abigail turned toward him. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes were sparkling. "You saved your home, Colton." "No," he corrected, stepping closer and gently moving a stray piece of hair from her forehead. "We saved our home." They stepped out of the bank and into the bright afternoon sun, ready to find a saloon, order the largest steaks in Wyoming, and then sleep for an entire week. But their plans for celebration came to a sudden halt. Standing in the middle of the muddy street, blocking their way to the hotel, was a solid line of men. In the very center of them stood Jebediah Roar. He looked completely out of place in the rugged town, wearing a perfect charcoal suit, a silk vest, and polished shoes that seemed to reject the street's filth. But his face was twisted into an expression of smug and hateful triumph. Next to him was the local sheriff, a man with a tin star pinned to a vest that was stretched too tight. The sheriff's hand rested anxiously on the butt of his pistol. Behind them, 4 deputies stood ready, holding double-barreled shotguns. Colton stopped in his tracks, his hand automatically falling to the peacemaker at his hip. Abigail gasped, instinctively moving behind his shoulder for a moment before she corrected herself and stood firmly beside him. "Mr. Sterling," Roar said, his voice cutting through the noise of the street, making everyone nearby fall silent. Passers-by. "Well now, looks like you sold off your cattle. A real hard worker, aren't you?" "Rock, you best get out of my path," Colton growled, his whole body wound as tight as a watch spring. "The fight's over. You lost." "Oh, I don't think so," Rock chuckled, a nasty sound as he straightened his suit cuffs. "The business is over. Now, we move on to the criminal part. Sheriff, if you'd be so kind." The sheriff coughed into his fist and shuffled forward, refusing to look Colton in the eye. "Colton Sterling, I've got a piece of paper here for your arrest." "On what grounds?" Colton shot back. "Kidnapping," the sheriff mumbled, holding up the warrant. "And moving a hostage across state lines. Mr. Rock here signed a statement saying you took his wife, Abigail Rock, from her home and dragged her out of state against her will." "That is a bald-faced lie," Abigail cried out, her voice breaking with pure rage. "I ran away from him. I pleaded with Colton to take me with him." Rock just looked at her, shaking his head with a look of fake pity. "My poor darling Abigail. That savage has got your mind all twisted up, hasn't he? Don't you worry, my sweet. We have doctors back in St. Louis who are experts at fixing confused ladies like yourself." He then turned back to the sheriff. "Arrest him. If he gives you any trouble, you shoot him down and get my wife. I have a private train car waiting at the station to take her to a quiet place where she can get her mind right." Two deputies stepped up, and the sound of them chambering rounds in their shotguns echoed down the street. Colton stared at the gun barrels aimed right at his heart. He did the math in his head. He was fast enough to draw and maybe take out Rock, but those deputies would cut him in two before he could fire again. And if that happened, Abigail would be right back in the hell she'd just escaped. "Don't you do it, Colt," Dutch's voice called out. Colton cut his eyes to the right. All his men, 20 tough-as-nails cowboys who'd ridden through hell and high water with him, were spread out along the boardwalks. They hadn't pulled their irons, but their hands were hovering right over them, just waiting on his word. It would turn into a bloodbath right there in the middle of Casper. "Colton?" Abigail whispered, and her voice was dead calm. He looked over at her, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on Rock. All the fear she had lived with for so long was gone, burned away by the raw injustice of it all. "He is not going to win," she said, her voice low and steady. "Not this time." Colton tried to step in front of her, but she was quicker. She lunged forward, closing the distance to Rock before anyone could even blink. Rock, who figured she was about to fall into his arms crying, just spread his arms wide with a smug grin on his face. "That's my good girl." But Abigail didn't hug him. She moved like a rattlesnake, striking. Her left hand shot out and grabbed Rock by his fancy silk tie, yanking him off his feet. In the same exact motion, her right hand pulled her big Colt revolver from its holster. She didn't bother aiming. She shoved that cold steel barrel right up under his chin, snapping his head back. "Don't anybody move!" she screamed, and the sound was a terrifying roar. The whole street went still. The deputies froze, their shotguns pointed uselessly. They couldn't take a shot without hitting the rich man. "Abigail!" Rock gasped out, his eyes wide with fear as he stared down the barrel of that gun. "Have you gone completely crazy? Put that down." "I just found my mine, Jebediah," she hissed, digging the gun in harder. "I found it out there in the rain. I found it caked in mud. I found it the second I realized a man who truly loves you doesn't treat you like a number on a ledger." She stared at the sheriff, her eyes burning with a wild fire that made the lawman take a step back. "Sheriff!" she yelled. "You want to arrest a kidnapper? Arrest him! He hired men to blow up a whole herd of cattle. He tried to get 20 men killed up in Devil's Pass. I was right there. I saw him do it. She's not thinking straight," Rock stammered, with sweat just pouring off his face. "Sheriff, shoot her! No, wait, don't shoot. Just do something." "Sheriff!" Colton's voice cut through the air, deep and full of authority. He moved to stand right beside Abigail, his hand resting on his own pistol, covering her back. "You're supposed to be a man of the law. I want you to look at her. Does she look like a woman who was taken against her will? Or does she look like a woman fighting for her very life?" Colton motioned toward the boardwalks. "I've got 20 witnesses right here who will swear that Rock's men set a trap for us. We've got the bodies of his hired guns up in that canyon to prove it. If you arrest me, you're standing up for a man who ordered a massacre. And my boys," he said, looking at his men, "well, they might just have a problem with that." The sheriff looked all around. He saw the 20 cowboys, their faces hard as stone, ready to go to war for their boss. He saw the townspeople gathering, murmuring their support for the rancher. Then he looked at Rock, a sweaty, scared little tyrant with a gun jammed under his chin. The whole situation had changed. The money Rock had paid him suddenly didn't seem like nearly enough to start a war over. "Mr. Rock," the sheriff said very slowly, taking his hand off his own gun. "It appears to me this is a family matter, and I don't get involved in family matters." "What?" Rock squeaked. "But I paid you." "You paid me for security," the sheriff cut him off. "Not to get myself killed. Deputies, stand down." The shotguns were lowered. Abigail, however, did not lower her gun. She stared right into Rock's eyes and saw nothing but a pathetic, empty man. For years, he had been the monster in her nightmares. Now he was just a coward in a dirty suit, shaking like a leaf. "I'm not your wife anymore, Jebediah," she said in a quiet voice. "My name is Abigail Sterling, and if you ever come near me, or my husband, or our ranch again, I will not think twice." With that, she shoved him hard. Rock stumbled backward, lost his footing in the mud and horse manure, and fell flat on his backside, ruining his expensive suit. A wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. Rock scrambled up, his face burning with shame. He looked for his allies, but the sheriff had already turned his back on him. He looked at Abigail, but she was standing tall, gun still in her hand, with the man she loved right beside her. "You will regret this," Rock screamed as he backed away. "I will ruin you both." "You already tried your best," Colton called after him. "And you lost. You better get back to St. Louis, Rock, before you get caught in a strong wind." Jebediah Rock turned tail and ran. He scurried toward the train station, losing a piece of his dignity with every single step. Abigail just watched him until he vanished around a corner. It was only then that her hand began to tremble. She put her pistol back in its holster and turned to Colton. He didn't have to say a thing. He just pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. She buried her face into his chest and started to cry. Not from sadness, but from the incredible relief of finally letting go of a lifetime of fear. "It's all over," Colton whispered into her hair. "Let's go on home." 6 months down the road, the Sterling Ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It had become a legend. And the wedding of Colton Sterling and Abigail Miller was the biggest celebration anyone had seen in a decade. They didn't get married inside a church, but out in a wide-open valley under that big Texas sky. Abigail didn't wear a fancy silk dress. She wore a simple white lace one with her rifle leaning right up against the altar. Folks say the King of the West had finally found his queen. Not some lady who was after his fortune, but a woman who was willing to fight to the death to protect it. And together they built a home and a future that no storm, no outlaw, and no rich city man could ever hope to tear down. If you enjoyed this tale of justice, love, and some good old-fashioned karma, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly does help this channel grow. And don't you forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good story, and be sure to subscribe for more tales like this one every single week. Now I have to ask you, what do you think you would have done if you were in Abigail's boots? Go on and let me know down in the comments below. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.